it should be pretty fun. Thank you everyone for coming. Pretty much everyone here should be aware by now that this is the MA-GCD, MA Graphic Communication Design course lecture series, which is also open to the broader graphic communication design program community. And we do even have, I think, some friends and family of the community joining online as well. So the theme of the lecture series this year is a continuation from last year. So its practice is still critical. And this is the second in the series for the year. I'll remind you now that we have our next talk in 2 weeks, same time, same place, with Louise Vormatag, who will be sharing a lot of work from her recently finished PhD in illustration and collaborative and community-based making practices. So be sure to join us again then. Tonight we are joined by Adam Bainbridge, who produces music as Kindness. Before I forget, we are sending around the bowl with post-it notes. Put your name on a post-it note, drop it back in the bowl. We do have some Technicolor prizes tonight. So some backstory, this is probably the longest courtship of anyone that I've invited to give a talk to MAGCD. I reached out to Adam, I looked on my phone, it was 3 years ago when I saw that they were teaching at Goldsmiths, and said like, ooh, maybe you should do something with our students. And they actually responded. And
that's what teaching at Goldsmiths does. It traumatizes you so much that you don't want to teach anywhere else.
It's a 3-year recovery period.
Yeah.
But thank you, Adam, for being here. Could we have a round of applause to welcome Adam, please? You might want to give something of an introduction. We also sent around an introduction with the invite for this talk. Adam is a musician, a producer, and they have produced music for people that you know, including Blood Orange, Dev Hynes, Solange, Robin, and it was for your work on Solange's album that you won a Grammy. Mm-hmm. So congratulations on that. And Adam is here to talk about visuals, graphic design, all the stuff that as it relates to their practice in the music business. You want to take it from there?
Sure, yeah. Hi. So I was talking to Robin today about this actually, and saying that there's some collaborators of ours called Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, and they gave a Red Bull Music Academy talk that lasted, I think it was 3.5 hours, and they only got into the first 5 years of their sort of 30-year career. So I'm not going to make that same mistake. Like, it was super interesting, but they went in too hard on the anecdotes and details. So I'm going to try and keep it moving. Just a little bit about myself. I am British, mixed race. My mum is Indian, my dad's white. I started this career, interestingly, as a cisgender man, and now identify as a trans feminine non-binary person. That's actually kind of part of the visual journey of this, is how do you sort of grow up in public as a trans person. You'll see it in the imagery. Almost like the best overview I can give of the whole 17 years I've been working in music. I started in a very, very DIY space with lots of horrible, crusty friends that just made terrible indie music. But I was quite inspired by how DIY they could be. They could just make releases, and there was a community for them, people that were mutually interested in kind of crusty white boy indie music. And then my first release came out on an indie label. That kicked off some crazy bidding war, God knows why, at major labels. I signed to a major label. I released my first album on it. Then I got dropped by the major label, signed to a bunch of indie labels for my second album, got dropped by all the indie labels, and then released my third album in 2019 on my own label. And that's what I should have done all along, I guess. And here we are in 2023, and I'm possibly working on a fourth album, but I haven't decided yet. So yeah, that's the overview. should we go back to the beginning then?
Yeah.
Okay, so I started out in the MySpace era, which probably most people, apart from the old people at the front, are too young to remember. I'm just kidding. And that was a bit of a Wild West. Those people that were old enough to be on it will remember, like, you coded your page and there were animated GIFs moving all around and text doing weird stuff. And I remember at the time, coming in on the tail end of it, I think I started my kindness page in about 2009 and just thinking, I'm going to keep things really simple because we've gone through this era of maximalism and kind of ugly graphic design. And I think if I'm doing something that is meant to be a little bit ambiguous and mysterious, like just keeping the imagery really stark might work quite well. So my partner at the time was a graphic designer, and I would use her Adobe suite to just mess around. And this is just, I don't know, found imagery, sort of moody, sort of sexy, then like, what font is that, like Futura or something, extra bold, bit of blur on it. You know, this is just like very amateur graphic design, but it started this kind of world that I could build on. And so everything on the MySpace was no pictures of me, found imagery, maybe with the kindness word on it, maybe not. And yeah, I don't know. I was going to talk about the importance of mystery, both in the pre-social media era, but I guess now as well. Like, there's that artist, Her, who for many years people didn't know who it was, and they were imagining that maybe she was another pre-existing R&B star that wanted a pseudonym, but the whole thing was you hadn't seen her face, and it was just the mystery really helped with that, launching that artist. And yeah, I think at the time artists hadn't done that for a minute, just been sort of anonymous online, no pictures of them. It really worked in my favor. I had a decent enough demo, and I got signed to this label, Moshi Moshi Records, who played a role in launching a lot of independent artists in the UK. I think Florence and the Machine went through that label. Yeah, other people that you would have heard of, but basically they would release one record on the label, a 7-inch, that would get picked up by the British music press. Then very often, if it was any good and the response in the press was sufficient, a major label might come calling and say, okay, we can see that you're connecting with an audience, we'll sign you and you can try and do this on a bigger scale. What worked in my favor was that apparently in 2009, when I got signed, major labels couldn't find anyone to sign. They thought everyone was terrible. And I wasn't much better, but apparently the fact that there were only 2 artists that year worth signing, myself and Jay Paul, meant that we both got record deals. And in my case, I got a record deal with an enormous amount of money. I don't know why. I was really like a DIY artist that made very weird sounding music that I didn't think had much crossover potential. But I think the guy that signed me was just like, fuck it, we don't have anyone else to spend this money on. And I think also their salary and their yearly bonus relied on signing an artist. They might have just been like, fine, you'll do. So I signed with Polydor. Oh, this was the design for the Moshi Moshi sleeve. I'm gonna bring this back. I found this found imagery on Flickr, and I reached out to the photographer, and he said, yeah, go for it. I like the homoeroticism of it, which again was something that was sort of lacking in music at the time. There's a bit of glare on this, but basically I got a high-res image, printed it out on a crappy printer. I didn't have a template for what 7-inch square looks like, so I actually did this on a Boney M sleeve. So that was the front. And then there was another transparency that I laid over with the word kindness cut out. And then this was the reverse. which again was a sort of collage-y thing. This was the notebook, if you can see the texture underneath. The notebook that I'd written all the lyrics in. This is a clothing tag, an empty clothing tag from a piece of clothing from Ridley Road Market. This is a little bit of note paper from a little notepad. And I was very much about sort of timeless, making sure that all of the sleeve art was as timeless as possible. So I really objected to the fact I had to put a barcode on it. But at least I got them to give me the barcode and printed it out rather than have it superimposed on the final printing, which is what they normally do. Okay, so that's 7" into, yeah, first album. So first album, I started working with, so, yeah, like I say, the marketing and artwork budgets were just silly, really, really silly. And I can't remember what the budget for the artwork overall or for the art direction and studio was, but we're probably talking about 20,000, 30,000 pounds. I don't know why. When I asked for a photography budget for like the album sleeve, they said, 3,000 to 5,000 pounds. And I was like, okay, well, for that price, I could just buy a photography studio, which is what I did. I went on Gumtree and I found a photographer who was selling all of his old Hasselblad gear. Yeah, you can kind of see it set up here. So I would have a music studio and a photography studio in one room of my flat. And I would sort of go from working on the music to switching to the other end of the room where I had a backdrop and taking self-portraits. I got really, really into Robert Mapplethorpe and how a lot of his pictures were self-portraits with a cable release. And I think you can see, yeah, there's the cable release in my hand there, and even the wire for it coming down there. In this particular sleeve, it's out of shop. I think, oh yeah, someone reminded me, this is an aside, someone reminded me that there was a lot of kind of snobbish hate about my project when it first came out. Maybe it was reasonable, I'm not sure. Like, I think making the transition from being a DIY artist to being a major label artist is always going to cause a bit of a ruckus. But one of the sort of really snide things that was said was that this jumper looked too expensive. They were like, fuck that guy, he's got an expensive jumper, which I did actually buy on eBay, so I don't know what the problem is, but...
Are these photo backdrops as well? Was that part of the kit that you bought?
So with the sleeves, the single sleeves, the design agency, who were called This Is Real Art, wanted to do a thing where they were layering in other layers of imagery. I didn't really want that, but I managed to like have my way and say, look, the album sleeve we're just going to leave as like an untouched image that doesn't have any extra layering. If this is going to like float your boat and make you feel like you're involved some way, put another layer in it, it's fine. I think we actually dropped that after this one, but that's like, again, it's another folder that I was using that had like a sort of tree print on it. So yeah, where are we now? We're at how they were spending too much money. So like, for example, I would take these photographs and I would actually, this was sort of me living some fantasy of 90s music industry, which when I got signed in 2010, 2011 was really finally coming to a close. The money was gone. The way that they'd used to spend budgets on cocaine and, you know, strip clubs, and like when I was getting signed, I would ask them to take me out to dinner. I'd be like, let's find the most expensive dinner in London. If you want to sign me, you have to take me out to dinner. And they would. But so I would actually take photos in the home studio, this is going to sound so crass, but it's true, and get a motorbike to courier them across London to my printer, who would then print up contact sheets and send them back. We weren't doing anything digitally. We were just being total 90s wankers, to be honest. But where was I? Yeah, so the other visual inspiration, and this, I was showing Matthew this a second ago, was this, yeah, switchback, this British graphic designer called Barney Bubbles, whose process was a lot of kind of very bright collage work. It started kind of more normie, but eventually became kind of more and more just very like iconic 80s imagery for this kind of I guess you'd almost call it like NME, you know. At the time it was like both the design style in the music press and in terms of record sleeves and promotional stuff. Oh, I didn't realize he did that Devo sleeve, but so what really interested me about this process was that you would take a photograph, which was obviously done in an analog way, and I was quite invested in analog photography at the time. And then the way that you would add text, and this kind of blows my mind that this is how they used to do things, was very often with photographic plates, either with separate plates that were superimposed, or this kind of letraset thing, which was literally scratch off letters on a piece of plastic sheet that you would take the thing that you wanted to add lettering to, and you would scratch a D, and then you would scratch a V and scratch an O. And if you fucked up, you fucked up, which was also kind of amazing. So I was looking into this and whether this was still possible, and ultimately no. Like, they didn't have the machinery, they didn't have designers that still worked that way. When I went to Polydor to ask about using what I considered kind of quite iconic imagery, the Polydor imagery, which one is it? Is it here? I said, you know, I'm not that thrilled about being signed to you because you're the bad guys at this point, but you do have this really beautiful iconography. Can we use these vinyl labels for the CDs and the vinyl that we produce? And they said, no one's asked for that for a good 20 years. We don't know where it is. And it turned out that even a major British label like this had basically misplaced their entire design archive. They didn't know where it was. They didn't know what had happened to it. They thought it got sent somewhere in a merger. And I was explaining to Matthew how I wanted to use the plates if possible. I couldn't. And then 2 years later, the Horrors did the same thing with their vinyl, but they probably just did a digital mock-up, which is fine. It's probably what I should have done. But as it happens, we ended up doing, again, like an exercise in minimalism. It's over here. This is the sleeve for the first album. So I took this, as I just explained, at home. And then this is everything that was on the back. There's a barcode, a Polydor label, and then that was my label logo designed by This Is Real Art. I decided my label would be called Female Energy, which, along with the androgynous homoerotic sleeve, seems to be a bit of like a foreshadowing for what might happen later. But yeah, this was meant to incorporate an electrical terminal for the energy and the kind of label, the symbol for femininity, in a vaguely Art Deco style. But I like it. I think it worked quite well. One of the other things I remember now that we also did in a vaguely Art Deco style was, with this obscene budget that they had, we made like letter paper. So we printed a bunch of
like letterhead,
kind of like letterhead, but like maybe it's in this book as well. Like, it turns out like the Rolling Stones and different celebrities used to have their own letterheaded paper, kind of like from the desk of Andy Warhol, that kind of thing, that would be designed by a famous designer. And mine didn't say female energy on it, but it was just this very like elaborate black and white paper with kind of embossing and designs. And when I sent out the first albums to friends, everyone would have like a handwritten note on this letterheaded paper. So yeah, also in an exercise of excess, this was the normal record sleeve, and inside there was this completely black on one side, kind of minimalist text. I didn't think the lyrics were worth including, so it was just sleeve notes. And then again, the vinyl itself is literally just A, B. What's kind of cool about vinyl is that you can actually add a tiny bit more information in a way that most people aren't aware of by inscribing it there in the most glossy part. You can kind of see the text is out of focus. But when you do the etching for the master, you can write in kind of a secret message. And I think because this album took me so long to do, the secret message was anything worth doing is worth doing slowly. But there were secret messages in all of the singles as well. So that was the regular consumer version. The over-the-top elaborate version was this, which is all very heavy paper, and then these individually printed photographs that were then stuck in by hand.
Well, I think, and just attached at the top, which
exactly.
is very chic. Yeah.
I'm sorry if any of this is coming off as obnoxious, but imagine it like you're a kid in a toy shop. Like someone says, here's a load of money. We want to spend it on your behalf. And a lot of my job at the time was just like, sure, do it. I don't mind. But again, not quite understanding the economics of how record deals worked. It turns out that making maybe 250 of these like put me £20,000 in debt, which at the time didn't really seem to matter, but now I'm like, well, that was stupid. But you know, it's kind of cute. Like these are all pictures I took myself. Like they have there's a lot of emotional resonance in all of these images. These are the actual master tapes, and then I would use a transparency and kind of like right on top. That's in the other sleeve somewhere as well, or in the CD booklet. And then here at the back we have another minimalist exercise. So yeah, that was album number 1. I'm sorry if I talked about it a lot, but it was kind of very formative, and it informed a lot of how things would go afterwards, I guess. Do you have any questions before I move on? Or does anyone have any questions before I move on? Okay, it gets less obnoxious from here because now it's just me making mistakes and being broke and being sued by people. So the second album, after I got dropped by the big behemoth, I released on a bunch of independent labels. Now here's where I want to talk about making mistakes. It might seem like I was being a bit flippant, but I really like the first album a lot. I like the music, I like the imagery. It was a real luxury to be given this enormous budget and to, yeah, just enjoy it, you know, honestly. As that era was ending, there was an opportunity to do something in such a kind of like silly old school way that I just embraced it. I thought, fuck it, let's make contact sheets and let's make silly promotional items and headed paper and have a photo studio in your house, like all of the things that just seemed like very over the top. When I was no longer on a major label, things got a lot more like, right, stop fucking around now. We got to do this and make it feasible for much smaller budgets. And also in a way that we're relying on our own expertise and a lot less of creative agencies, which I'm not necessarily saying was helpful. Like often the creative agency was just executing a vision that you gave them, but at least there are enough people in the room to say, okay, this is how we stay on track for a deadline. My opinion is this isn't quite working, blah, 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 blah. The second album, I met someone that a close friend was dating, and he said, I'm a designer. I go to this Swiss art school for design. So far, so good. But he also said, I know this really well-known, very homoerotic fashion photographer that I'm not going to name because it would be disrespectful of me, but who's quite a big deal and does a lot of editorial stuff and like has photo books that you can buy in fancy photo stores, and whose work I really loved. And the designer said, you know, if you want, we could talk to Mr. X about shooting the sleeve. And I was like, yeah, fucking hell, why not? That sounds great. Okay, what are the two mistakes I made here? If you see a photographer's imagery and all of it is like muscle boys, half naked, doing like very Bruce Weber stuff. It isn't Bruce Weber, so I can say Bruce Weber. Frolicking covered in oil in like sand dunes. He's a good photographer, but he's not necessarily going to take good photos of me. Secondly, all of those editorial shoots come with enormous teams. Like, yes, the guys are wearing nothing, but there's still stylists and makeup artists and production assistants. When I went out to Zurich to shoot these photos, they didn't have a location, they didn't have grooming, they didn't have styling. I just showed up with my own clothes on my back, and they said, we're going out to the mountains and the hills. And I was like, great, what does that have to do with the album I just made? And they were like, that's where he wants to shoot. I was like, okay. I said, what about makeup? Like, I'm really tired. Like, can we just even get some concealer on? Sure. They put concealer in the bags under my eyes. And I think that was maybe the biggest mistake of this whole process. So those of you who wear makeup will know this. I didn't know this at the time, but certain concealer brands contain an SPF that reflects flashes back. Maybe you've seen it in the photos of your friends out in a club where like you get it back and you just have these bizarre kind of like white stripes under your eye. And Mr. X, the famous fashion photographer, was taking pictures analog on film, and he always uses flash. So to look at on a phone or in a mirror, like I was like, nice, face looks good, eye bags aren't showing. We get the 4 rolls of camera film back, and it was all just like me sitting on tractors and hay bales and like frolicking in fields that have absolutely nothing to do with the record. But also they were completely unusable because every single shot had me with these like glaring bright white patches under my eyes in a way that you couldn't even retouch. It would just look so artificial. And I remember thinking, like just by cutting corners on things like grooming or styling, you can doom an entire album shoot. Now it's unusable. And I never actually managed to have the difficult conversation either with the photographer or really explain to the team like why I wasn't going to use any of this imagery. I think we all just looked at it and knew. We knew that it wasn't going to work. We paid him his kill fee, or it wasn't a lot of money. It was like really like mates rates. I think the mates rates part was also maybe part of the error, because you're paying someone so little for their professional job. You have no recourse to criticize when it doesn't turn out well. You know, they weren't given the means to do their job properly. Anyway, don't use reflective concealer for anything ever. And so a process began of scrabbling around for a new sleeve. And to this day, no disrespect to anyone involved in this, I hate this sleeve so much. I absolutely despise this image. I think that's almost a good thing to go through. Like, part of the reason why I left it up on the screen for as long as I did is because you're all probably completely sick of it and understand how I feel. And everything that we try to do, like even like this exercise and minimalism, it's like, what does that have to do with anything? It means nothing. The whole sleeve just pisses me off because I feel like we missed the brief so hard. Like, that's ugly. Why is that there? The one thing that I liked about this sleeve was that, having been so austere with the black and white, one of the Swiss designers was like, let's put yellow on it. And that really worked. Like, I really like the yellow. On this Japanese release, the jewel case, like, it looks kind of cute. And then what's really nice is they have that little Japanese thing that comes on releases. I'm quite proud of that to this day. I was also saying, this is a little shout out to me because I haven't had very many wins on this particular album, but in Japan, they sometimes commission essays about an album when they release it, which I think is really sweet. That said, I don't speak Japanese, so it might all be incredibly critical.
We do have some students who speak Japanese.
Yeah, but I wouldn't want to put you in the position of being like, yeah, it's just someone in.
Very positive.
It's just someone in Japanese saying, we don't understand this artwork, it's horrible. And that, again, it was interesting. It was one of the, when you're a musician, you have to put up with quite snide feedback from the music press, especially. And someone was like, we're really glad that Kindness has a new album, but we hate the sleeve. And what was going through their mind? Like, why would you do that? And then what I found kind of sad was that they compared my sleeve, which is just a picture of my face, in all honesty, like, that kind of hurts that it's grotesque. But they compared it to Conan Moccassin's sleeve, where Conan Moccasin was in deliberately grotesque makeup or a mask or something. And it was like, well, that's meant to be offensive. That's just my face. But I was going to come to another thing before we dive further into this sleeve and the imagery. So all of this photography was taken by an ex-partner. So it's very much like the intimacy of the lens, very close, like, you know, the kind of imagery that might be taken by a partner who's a photographer, for example. And what was my point about this? Oh, yeah. The thing that I do like about this second album is, if I was trying to lose a section of my audience, if there are a bunch of bros that like my first album, even if they reluctantly liked it because the sleeve was someone sort of faggy looking, wearing an expensive sweater, it was neutral enough that they were just like, oh yeah, I've listened to that, I've got it on my shelf. This, wherever it is, God, I could think that there would be a number of straight men that would just be uncomfortable owning that album, simply because of the way it looks. And I genuinely think that's a factor. I think that some people were just like, really? No, and just didn't invest in the second album, and probably anything beyond that, because this ended up being the third album sleeve, because it sort of offended their sensibility as maybe like a cis straight man who was very proud of their straightness and very much offended by sort of ambiguity or homoeroticism. And then that became a bit of a theme during the marketing of the second album, where they'd be like, so, you know, it's going all right, but we might need to do tube posters in the tube. And they were like, are we really going to use this in the tube? I was like, no, we're not, because that's not going to do any good. Like, we're not going to sell albums that way. Like, for me personally, we have to find something that is less like, here I am, this is an intimate look at my face, like, I'm very vulnerable. Like, it kind of makes me feel uncomfortable right now, honestly. So we ended up using something, I don't know, really bland. But that's the thing, is like, how you spend your money when you have a limited amount of money is really important. Honestly, I think this whole thing was a bit of a waste of money. And it brings me to this other point, which is that there's a vulnerability to putting yourself on an album cover. Like, not only if you're gender non-conforming, but just like putting yourself on an album cover is kind of, again, sort of inviting people to judge your face ultimately. And I think much more like canny artists, and I really do think it's canny on so many levels, thought about how branding was working outside of music, and with the help of smart management teams and design teams, went into something more like this. Now, I think it's really corporate. It's not for me, but as something that you can remix and recycle and put on merch and use as stage backdrops and stage props and billboards, it's perfect. It's exactly what it needs to be. And it's genius. Also, it's harder when you're a group of 3 people to produce one image that's like, here we are, we're a band. Maybe you're not going to do it for that reason. But I remember seeing the first XX sleeve and just being like, wow, it's almost cynical in its simplicity, but it's so smart, you know, kudos to them. And I really like Ollie and Romy and Jamie. So, you know, shout out to them and being smart. The people I don't like are these guys. Not only because they're a bunch of pricks, but they make terrible music, and I call them the streaming Bee Gees privately. They're really racist. Part of their first campaign, if you go and look, was basically digital blackface. Every video was only black people. The image that XL would send out to the press was 2 black men wearing Adidas tracksuits. That wasn't Jungle. Jungle are 2 rich white guys from Chelsea. And this was when branding and ambiguity just became really gross to me. And to this day, no one in the British music press has ever called them out for it, because I think it makes accusing people of racism in England is just not done. You don't do it, especially when the music press is predominantly white men like this band. You know, they're not going to be like, wow, that was gross. They're not even going to think about it ultimately. But the New York Times actually did a piece when this album first came out saying, wait, what just happened? These people were trying to make us think that they were black artists for a year and a half, and then it turns out they're 2 white guys. Like, isn't that fucked up? And now, honestly, it hurts. It hurts because on TikTok, I see that there's a Black American audience that's becoming more and more invested in Jungle and their music. And I'm just like, if you knew how cynical and disrespectful these people have been at the beginning of their career, I don't think you'd feel the same way that you do. But this has never been discussed in the press. Anyway, that's me being a hater, and it's sufficient. The other thing that I'm going to say about branding and the necessity of getting on the branding train is that part of my first album contract was that I didn't have to have social media, and that was a mistake. I wish I had something visual, let's say it's that, to explain how much of a mistake it was. 2010, the only real social media platform of any importance was Facebook. But I hated Facebook. I hated the way it looked. I hated the obligation of it. I hated reading what my uncle wanted to say about anything. So I didn't use it. And I've gone through periods in my life of using a platform because you have to, and then eventually just saying, no, I refuse. Like, I need to put an end to this, which is where I am with Instagram and Twitter now. I don't use them anymore. But the record label, bizarrely, at that moment in time, they must have seen the potential future importance of social media, but at that time it wasn't an obligation. So when I said, I don't want to have social media, I'll have a website, they were like, okay. And I got it written into the contract, no need for social media. The problem with that was that all of the money that got spent on the first album, all of this insane budget, it sort of ended up going nowhere. you basically put all of these marketing and even the music out there in the world, and then you give no one a place to congregate and sort of feel a belonging, because ultimately, even though they've sort of changed in purpose, things like following someone on Instagram was a way of saying, all right, I'm a member of this tribe, even on a very superficial level. Like, I endorse this thing, or I'm interested in it. I want to know what update I'm going to get about this. And by not doing that, even though Instagram was barely a thing at the time, all it led to was like fake pages being created on Facebook, and like even VK, the Russian social media. Like the Russian social media page for kindness had all of these unreleased demos and stuff that I didn't even know how was out in the world. But like, people were interested. I'd just given them nowhere to go, which was a bit of an issue. And so the second album, I was like, fuck, I better get on this train belatedly. And yeah, I was there ever since, and it became somewhat of a necessity, as I'm sure people are aware. Which brings me to the third album, if we can just talk about that briefly. So back to being completely independent. I financed this entirely myself. I stayed with the Female Energy label, which is mine. We released this through a distributor, so I had to front load all of the costs. Like, anything that comes back from releasing an album isn't there yet, and they weren't advancing many costs. So like, the graphic design I had to pay for up front, the photography, the mixing, the mastering, the musicians themselves. So it's kind of hard. And I found this really wonderful art director called Isha Dipikawalia. I'm South Asian, so I wanted to work with other South Asian femmes. And on this album as well, having had such a horrible mistake with the white Swiss men, I wanted to work with only femmes as well. I didn't want to work with men anymore. And so everything on the visual side of this album was a non-cis man in some shape or form, which I'm really proud of. I also tried to make sure that my band was only non-men as well, but it wasn't quite possible. It was in Europe, but it wasn't possible in America. And so this sleeve was shot by a photographer from Singapore called Michelle Yong, who does a lot of fashion photography. But it was amazing working with her. She's probably the best photographer I've ever worked with for direction. So I arrived and I was like, this is kind of what I have in mind, but like, I need your help. Like, we really need to think about the ideas of vulnerability and like gender, and also we're trying to create more than one image. We need sort of 5 or 6 for the rest of the campaign. Like, the problem is, like, when you put imagery out in the world at the beginning of a campaign, 9 months later, when the campaign's still going, your PR turns to you and it's like, we need all new imagery. But the press image has to change. Like this, we need new sort of like snapshot art. Like, everything has to refresh because people are tired of it ultimately. So when you're doing an album sleeve, not only do you have to think about the sleeve, you have to think about singles, you have to think about 9 months down the line. But yeah, Isha did a really wonderful job. I'm so proud of this record. Maybe you can take the cellophane off. And it's this gatefold, which is really beautiful. We ended up picking up this pink for the tour t-shirts.
Only sort of picks up on that bottom corner.
Yeah, it's that color. And then finally, because I was proud of the lyrics, this album actually has lyrics in it, and these other shoots. And yeah, she was so gifted and easy to work with, and I think it was really this thing of like, wow, women have ego, but in a different way, like in a useful way. And everything was just an easy conversation, super responsive, and we got it done in time without any tears. We didn't, it was just great, really. And interestingly, she's gone on to work with Lady Gaga and like pretty high profile stuff. Like Isha was really doing like DIY artists, like very much Tommy Genesis, Quiet Luke, like very like niche kind of like alt culture stuff. And yeah, now she does Lady Gaga and like tour art direction as well, I think. And this, what color is, oh, so this is one more aside, is that interestingly, in the era of vinyl, colored vinyl, one thing they don't tell you is that this looks amazing, like a white vinyl or a pink vinyl or an orange vinyl. It sounds terrible. So for sound quality, you actually just have to make the plain old black stuff. But another part of releasing music on vinyl now is a lot of people buy it just to have the object. They're not necessarily going to play it anyway. So me, much of a muchness. And then the one other thing that I haven't talked about is videos. We did videos for the first album. We did 2 for the second album. A friend of mine actually works with the XX, and they were talking about a release. So it's maybe like 2018 now. And I trust the team that work with that artist, that group a lot, because like they always get it right. Somehow they've always made good decisions. And basically they said that there's no point in making more than one music video now. You kind of have a stored potential of interest within a fan base, where a fan base want to see the visual presentation of an album at the beginning of a campaign, and then they kind of lose interest. And I think that makes sense when you're bombarded by imagery and you're bombarded by visual imagery all the time, and especially in sort of shorter and shorter formats. Okay, you're going to take 3 minutes out of your day to watch a music video once as a favor to the artist. But if someone's like, oh, we've created a suite of 19 4-minute films about my trip to like Budapest, like it's just not interesting anymore. And I understand why. Interestingly, my only contribution to this album was camera phone filmed videos. So I had an editor who was just like, just give me all the stuff in your Google photo album and I'll make something out of it. And it ended up being really touching. Like I thought it was a lot more honest and insightful into the recording process and like friendships. There were a lot of friends and lovers and collaborators in it. But even then, I'm not sure if it's of that much interest to anyone but like me and my community. And I think that's hard. Like we sort of had this change in the music video landscape where everything had to be kind of a blockbuster and have a hook to it. Otherwise, it just was more noise and information. And even back in...
Pull them up without sound? Or?
Yeah, you could put them on without sound. Even in 2011, when we were first doing these music videos with Partisan, who are quite big video agency, I remember Sasha saying, when we first did, oh yeah, this is the one for Raise Up with camera phone footage. I remember Sasha saying, you know, when we first did videos in Partisan in the mid-2000s, and Sasha represented Michel Gondry, we would release a new video on the internet and people would talk about it for 2 months. So like it might be the Chemical Brothers one with the train journey and everything's sort of bizarrely in sync with the music, or it might be some terrible Fatboy Slim video, but people would be like, wow, it's a talking point. It was like the equivalent of whatever water cooler moments are, but for young people. And she said in 2011, they would release a huge budget video by one of those like top name, like A-list directors, and it would get about 12 hours of traction on the internet. And then people would move on to the next thing. And she was like, that's the reason why Hype Williams isn't a thing anymore. That's the reason why Michel Gondry directs feature films, is that you could give people the budget to make a $2 million video, but the attention span isn't there. And the competition for bandwidth is just absurd. And a label isn't going to say, sure, make a Hype Williams video if it's going to get 12 hours of response from an audience. So that's part of the reason why there aren't big videos anymore. Maybe you want to do the raffle prize and we take a moment together.
So an interlude for prizes. Do you want to draw the name?
Oh yeah, sure. And in that I've just talked continuously. If anyone wants to ask a question, please do. Is it already decided what they're going to get?
No, you could Kismet.
Hey.
Oh, so we have. They could choose out of the box, or you could just decide which one they get.
No, that's too much responsibility.
Okay. So we have a box. The theme is Technicolor. Try not to look, just to make it more of a surprise. It's chocolates. There's one of the prizes.
See, it was really worthwhile coming to this talk because there's chocolate. Do you have any questions?
Well, I was curious about some of the images that we skipped over. You had street shots, like almost like Google Street View or something.
Oh, okay, yeah.
I was curious about those.
So this song, Cyan, that was the first single release, this thing here. And I'd basically been inactive for about 2 years making my album. And I had this idea for this song where I would take really long bus journeys through Tottenham and Enfield. And I noticed that a lot of the shop fronts had really cool names like this, like Heads High. Some of these are just pulled off Google Images, Planet News, Future Designs, Everybody's Music, Reckless Record. It was basically that I thought there was a kind of like poetry to those kind of quite bizarre shop names. So I wrote them all down, and then I wrote the lyrics for the song based on all of those different shop names, with a view to being able to make a music video where every shop would represent a different line in the song. So these are the shop fronts that inspired the album, the lyrics. And what really sucks is that all of these were here and they existed here in London. And then we went to commission the video, and yeah, the Cyan video, and not a single British production company could bring it in on budget. So we actually ended up filming it in New York and having to re-find all of the shop signs in America because Brits are useless. But you know what? I think it was kind of more exciting to do it in America. And yeah, it was like a fun experience. We didn't have permits though. We were driving around Manhattan in a truck with no windows, and sometimes jumping out and filming on the street. And we thought we were going to get busted constantly because you're meant to have a permit. I think they said, if anyone stops us, just say we're making a student film. It's like, yeah, why not? But yeah. Again, I don't know what I'm wearing. Horrible shorts. But yeah, as a concept, it was kind of fun. I worked with this guy, Jesse Ray, or I interviewed him for a radio show, and he's this mad Scotsman who only dresses in ceremonial Scottish dress at all times. He doesn't take it off to go to bed. He's like wearing the visor and the kilt and the chainmail, and he always carries around a ceremonial sword as well. He's been arrested for wearing this to magistrate's court, but he makes funk music. He worked with Roger Troutman and Bernie Worrell and stuff. Like his bona fide's legit. Like he's made funk music, but he's this crazy Scot. And he wrote a disco song called Inside Out by Odyssey, which made him a lot of money. And so in the mid-'80s, he was shooting all of these videos with helicopters and steam trains in Scotland, climbing up the Brooklyn Bridge and doing, again, helicopter shoots in New York. And I was just like, this guy's an absolute Fruit Loop. I need to meet him and sort of see where he's coming from. And he was like, the thing for me was that I would always write the song with the music video in mind. I was like, like, so the music video was coming before the song. He's like, yeah, kind of. I just like imagine swooping in over the city and like my longsword flying through the air and like a girl breakdancing, and then I'd write the song to that imagery. So I kind of took inspiration from that, and this is the only song I've ever done that way. And if you think I'm joking, we could bring up one of his videos, but we'll do that while we're talking about something else. Did you have any other questions?
Well, so in that, I'm going to ask one more, Lauren, and then we'll get to you. There was something about that video, which we didn't get to yet, and then G-Up, I think. Mm-hmm. And then in some of your photographs where there's a kind of figurative zooming out to some of the apparatus of production, right? So we see the cameraman, we see in G-Up video, we see like, we go actually onto set, right? And I think there was even something there in the Hasselblad shots that you took of like seeing the seeing of the taking of the photo as well as the seeing of the production of music. I wondered is that an interest in process and the way things are made?
Yeah, I mean, again, it was part of this thing where it was the ending of the era of budgets in the music industry, and say the photograph printer that I work with. So like with this, someone had to handprint everything. I wasn't joking, was I? And Robin Bell, who did it, like one of the promotional things we did for the first album was just a conversation with Robin, and we printed it. We like used one of those London printers that does like a quick turnaround on newsprint, and just made a little mini newspaper where I was interviewing him about his process. But part of it for me was like, these are artisans. These are people doing soon to be obsolete processes, and like what an amazing talent. Like he still does museum printing for like if there's a David Bailey exhibition, or the V&A is doing sort of classic mountaineering or National Geographic, they'll send the black and white negative to him to print. But no one knows his name. You know, he's probably at the highest level of black and white photo printing in this country anyway, but soon it will be a forgotten art. And yeah, I'd like, a lot of this was, can I acknowledge the art form that goes into recording properly in a record studio? Like me and Philippe recorded this first album in Paris over about 9 months in Philippe's studio. And when people said, oh, this record really sounds like the 80s, I was like, it doesn't sound like the 80s, it sounds like a recording studio. It's that we don't have albums that are done start to finish in a studio with microphones and a mixing console, and where the computer is sort of secondary to the work process. What you hear and what sonically sounds like a 1980s record to you is simply the sound of all of these machines and synths and guitars being recorded in a very similar style. So, yeah. If this is distracting, maybe we should stop.
Did you have more you wanted to cover? Should we start taking questions from the group?
Sure, yeah.
Wait, did we lose Lauren? Oh, there. Did you want to ask your question? You want to shout it out?
Do you want a microphone? Just careful of the feedback, though. Oh, yeah, nice.
Hello.
Hi.
I felt kind of offended when you said you hated your second album, because like I feel really nostalgic, kind of like looking at your images, because I remember waiting for your second album and like listening to the first one, and I remember that at the time of release, the album art really didn't match the sound of it. And that was so interesting to me. The sort of like the contrast between that made it more fascinating to me. And I think like what Matthew, oh my God, my brain went in a different direction. So I think I want to know like how you feel about people having different interpretations of your work, or like liking elements that you hate, and or even like repurposing your work. And okay, I have another question. I realize it's unrelated, but
Well, I can answer that to begin with. I mean, thank you for being so generous. I think also I'm like, I find it useful to just be honest, like things have changed for me. I just don't like it, and I think that's fine. It's okay to not like it. And it's also very much okay for people to be appreciative of it. I think like, you know, on many levels, it reminds me of this, where it's sort of not a flattering image in any way. And I think what you see here is an artist who was just interested in music first and foremost. I think that was part of what was hard for me, is that I'm a musician. I never realized that such a big part of being a musician in a contemporary era was having like such a huge responsibility in the visual language that went around it as well. And some artists are really good at that. Like some artists, I think, could quite easily be art directors or designers because they just instinctively know how to represent themselves. I did an okay job with my first album because it was me taking the images and I was sort of building on the black and white thing that I'd already done. With the second one, I was like, I have no idea. Like, I just want to focus on making the album. That's hard enough as it is. I need expertise and I need like someone from the outside to say like, let's try this. Like, or even this thing of, and this is going to sound, I don't know, like superficial, but like what is happening now? Like this was 2015. Like what is sort of relevant in a design language right now? I'd already done something where I tried to be as timeless as possible. And so I was like, okay, let's embrace modernity. Like what could we do that is relevant to a visual language now? And I don't think they did a bad job. They did a really good job with the imagery they were given. Like it's quite like, it does what it needs to do. But maybe it's also that for me, it doesn't even represent how I feel on a kind of like on a gender level, you know, like we had to do all of this retouching where we were taking out facial hair, and I kept being like, more facial hair gone. Like it was this thing of like, I was kind of mad that people insisted on flash photography as this very much, it was kind of like that Jürgen Teller, like Contax G7 era of like, oh, we're going to like do flash photography. Everything is flash, flash, flash. And it had a newness to it or a modernity, but it wasn't very flattering. And so part of my dilemma was like, okay, we have a package that sort of represents 2015 modernity, but I hate it. And that's fine. I don't know if that answered your question or if you have the other question.
Yeah, it kind of did. My other question is kind of like about queerness, because I don't know, like looking at these images now, I feel very like emotional. Like it kind of like buried in my brain, but I do remember them. And I remember at that point in time, like the way that you were photographed on your first album, it showed me a gender that I wanted, but I didn't have. And so I felt like I grew along with that. And that was something that Matthew said you were going to touch on, like how you grew up and with your gender in a public eye, and like how you feel about that, because your first album too, like your stage name, it's intentionally anonymous, so there is like, it's easier for that personal boundary to not be crossed, whereas if your face becomes an icon, I wonder how you feel about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I think the thing I would say is that I tried as hard as possible to maintain a sense of androgyny in all of the imagery and all of the sleeves. But, and this kind of ties back to what you were saying, Matthew, about how language has been part of this graphic course. What's really interesting about gender nonconformity is that you can look any way you want. Like, I could look as feminine as possible. If my pronouns in the press are he, him, no one is going to read me in any other way but that. I might just be in an effeminate looking man. And it was only the third album where non-binary identities were starting to become more widely discussed and more mainstream that I said to my press and my team, I was like, I use they, them with my friends. I'm going to use it in the press. Like, can we do that? And we did. And I think it really helped, like, this kind of doubling down, which is like, okay, you see the imagery and you see the quest for androgyny and gender nonconformingness in the imagery, but I'm also going to telegraph to you that this is absolutely a non-binary identity or a trans feminine identity by just saying it. And it shouldn't have to necessarily be the case. You shouldn't have to always telegraph things about identity. You know, there's a lot of discussion about how certain artists are still walking a tightrope of not disclosing whether they're queer or not disclosing whether they have a non-cis identity and how that's their own business. And maybe it is, but yeah, we're kind of in a contemporary culture where I actually think it's, if you can, if like you're safe enough or established enough to say, well, this is how I perceive my gender or this is how I perceive queerness, you're probably helping someone else begin their own journey along that line. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of my own feeling about this, but I think that there's something, even acknowledging the right that all artists and public figures have to privacy, there's nothing quite like seeing something of your own identity out there in the world and what that does for you, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I think I also feel conflicted about it because I think, you know, the fact that there's a word for it means that it's common enough. Like the fact that the word queer baiting exists, you know, there's plenty of artists who have realized the potential power of and the marketability of androgyny or sort of gender expansiveness or tapping into a queer audience. And let's face it, I think as time goes on, probably the majority of a young demographic that's engaged with art and music will identify with queerness in some shape or form. So getting on that train early can be helpful. I mean, even Taylor Swift is sort of flirting with like the is she, isn't she thing now. And I'm just like, because for me, whether it's Taylor Swift or whether it's...
She's also done the colored vinyl, like, whoa.
Yeah. Whether it's another famous British ex-boy band member who won't be named, it's not going to do any harm to your career. If anything, it's probably going to help your career to just say, oh yeah, I have a boyfriend or I date a trans person. Like, just, I don't understand the caginess, but I think part of it is there's the mystique that we talked about earlier on in terms of like relative anonymity now plays into people's private lives. Or yeah, just the other thing I wanted to say about Instagram, I remember a few years ago, a DJ friend of mine said that there'd been a generational shift in that now when he DJs in the club, people will walk into the DJ booth and literally lean over the decks and like look at what the name of the song is, or they might sort of like jog his arm while he's DJing. And he said he thought it represented the breaking down of separation between the artist and the audience, because you're just a DM away from anyone that wants to get in touch with you. He's like, people seem to take this, what's it called, like parasocial relationship that exists online and think that it also exists in reality. That if they see you on the street, they can literally be like, yo, bro, how did XYZ? And I think that wasn't quite the case before, but there is a using blurring of lines now, because the other thing that music marketing and social media asks us to do is to really engage in a super intimate, day-to-day hyper openness about your life and who you are, and yeah, engage with people on that level. So are you that surprised when people are over familiar or also intrusively interested in different parts of your private life?
Wonder if anyone else in the audience, also in the chat, has a question. George?
So you spoke a lot about your bigger albums over the years. The 2019 singles you did, what was the inspiration behind the artwork for those?
Yeah, part of it was that when I did the deal with Michelle for the sleeve artwork, we could only afford 5 images from the total set. So it's like, okay, 1 image for the front, a couple of images for the inner sleeve, a couple of images for press. Now we're out of images. So I can't use myself on the cover of sleeves. And maybe that's fine, because I also really trusted Deepika to come up with some single sleeves. Where's Bandcamp? And so I think possibly they're just, let me see, I need to look at them. Okay, so this was taken by my ex-partner on a holiday, and I think Deepika liked the image but thought it needed to be layered with something, back to layering again. Then that picture of Sainabo was actually from a shoot that she did in Gambia with a different photographer, and we licensed it. And this is a found imagery from the steps of a museum in Philadelphia, which was meant to be a reference to Jasmine Sullivan. And I think we thought that it was a bit cheeky to ask a huge R&B star if we could use their image on a single sleeve. So yeah, those were the 3 single sleeves, but it's just hard. Like, honestly, I'd say unless you have a huge team and unless you have this enormous whiteboard with all of the flowchart of we do this, then we do this, then we do this, you'll get to a point in a campaign where you're like, oh fuck, we've forgotten to even design this, like a t-shirt or a poster or a tote bag, and then you have to do it, and you have to do it way too fast. And I'm not saying that's the case with these single sleeves, but I just think we were kind of struggling with a lack of raw material and having to just be creative with a limited budget, a limited amount of time. And yeah, just like, the imagery is expensive ultimately to create good imagery.
So we haven't actually talked about your music directly at all.
Well, we shouldn't do that. Yeah, we can.
Well, but this question of making do with like limited resources, limited budgets, I'm curious to what degree the music also went on that kind of journey of budgets and resources and what that meant for the music.
Yeah, I mean, again, when you're self-financing something, you get to decide how much you allocate to the different areas of the project. And I think I'm just resentful. I'm sort of resentful of the idea that as a musician, so much of how I communicate my work is visual. I'm not saying that it's I think visuals are beautiful, and I think there's an art form to this kind of packaging and communication. But as a musician, I'm like, why is it as important as the music? Because the music might take me 5 or 6 years, and yet at some point in that process, we have to design one single square image, which is going to represent the totality of that project. And it's also frustrating in that we've gone from an era of you go into a record store and you see it at this format, like a 12 by 12 image, to even like on a laptop, you know, like an individual release like this. That's how big we're talking. like all of that work and all of that labor is that big on a laptop and maybe a quarter of the size on a smartphone. And you'd just be like, what do we do? Like, how much is the rational amount of money out of an overall budget for a project to portion out for sleeve imagery? Again, it's why I think like the XX and the Jungle and people that have the visual language that they can kind of come back to and remix in some way, like it's really smart because you're not overextending yourself in that space. But yeah, I don't know if that sort of answers your question. The music was always my priority. I would sort of spend up until the deadline for an album release and be like, oh God, I'm out of money. And then I would go into an overdraft on a credit card or something to pay the visuals.
Oh yeah, at the back, I think your hand went up first. Shall I run with the mic, or do you want to scream?
Go with the mic. No one wants to scream.
So like for like the beginning of your journey, like in your music career, you more or less like started like in a DIY sort of like counterpart. In a way, like your imagery was so pure. In a way, like you were showcasing yourself and you're doing self-portraits of yourself, and you were on Gumtree buying this equipment and processing that. Like, what made that kind of like that shift of like you wanted to kind of like now kind of outsource you, like how people take images of you or how to present yourself even more? Like, because in a way, like there was like a sense of purity in your first few covers, like how you were like doing that, and I like that story so much of like how you said even when you started music, like it was just you and your crusty friends. That was kind of like funny.
Yeah, you haven't met those crusty friends.
But yeah.
So I directed videos for myself and for other people, and I remember when I was directing the videos being like, this is cool, this is easy, I like this is really fun. And then by about the 5th video being like, that's it, that's all the ideas I have. This was really hard. And that's what makes that job so much harder, is constantly having a good idea and the motivation and the drive to do it. And I think similarly with like the artwork, when I started out, it sort of worked and there was an honesty to it. But if I had to rely on my own motivation and visual knowledge to keep making artwork for the 2nd and 3rd and 4th and 5th, whatever, it would have been horrible because I don't have that many good ideas. Like the whole thing with, I really honestly think this about anything, is like you can go into a field you know nothing about and like knock it out the ballpark once because you're just coming to it so fresh with your own really personal take. And there's a naivety to it and there's an honesty and a purity to it, as you say. What's really hard is doing it again and again and again. And I'm sure you must feel this in your work. Like sometimes you'll be like, first year of St. Martin's was great because all my ideas were hitting and it just felt so fresh and like easy to represent myself in my work. And then 3rd year, you're like, again, I have to make another idea. Like it's hard. And so I think in terms of collaboration, sometimes that's where you're like, I know I'm going to hit a brick wall. Let me reach out to someone whose whole life rotates around this skill and sort of at least make it a conversation. I don't think it was ever too much like, you do all of this, I completely entrust everything to you. I want there to be something collaborative to it. But yeah, ultimately it's like just too hard to have perfect ideas over and over again.
Here I come.
Do you have many regrets from your career?
Yeah, that's a good question. Is that to do with visuals or just in general?
Anything.
Well, yeah, actually, look, this is really good. This is like you're like a planted questioner in the audience. Matthew was asking me why, if you go to like kindness.es, which is my webpage now, this is what it brings up. And it was during the pandemic, I was sort of doing a lot more like work with the Union of Musicians and Allied Music Workers in America and different sort of trade union things around music. And I realized that so many of the mistakes I'd made had been from a position of a lack of knowledge, like whether it was a legal fuck up or spending too much money on something or creating conflict with the collaborator because I didn't understand like how we should negotiate a collaboration on paper. These are things that I know now, but when I started out my career, I had no idea. And what's really dark about music as well is like very often a manager or a music lawyer will charge you for this expertise. Like they are literally preying on young people that don't have a very like even superficial awareness of like how certain things work. So I kind of wanted to demystify that and like have all of these terms here. And almost every single term in this list will be somehow related to a regret of some kind, where I'm like, I wish I'd known this about accountants. I wish I'd known this about business managers. I wish I'd understood what this term meant. And not paid someone to explain it to me because, you know, why wasn't this information being shared in a kind of professional community? It's even like, it's a bit, like I say, it's kind of dark, but I'll meet much more successful artists than myself and I'll ask them about the record deals they have and like how long they're for and what the royalty sharing is, and they don't know. And I think it's because part of the glamour of the profession is just like, oh, someone else will take care of that. And then when it comes to like crunch, when you're either like broke or like I say, you're being sued by someone, like all of a sudden you need to know all of this stuff. And it's sort of been kept away from you, either because of your like willful ignorance or just because like you don't have time to explore all this. Like it was crazy writing this list. I was like, actually, that's what 17 years of experience looks like. But if I meet someone in there in the first like 2 years of doing this, I don't expect them to know a single one of these things. And why would you? More specific regrets. I once told Jay-Z and Beyonce that I didn't want to come DJ their New Year's Eve party because I wanted to stay in Leytonstone and have New Year with my partner. I think that might have been a mistake.
Can I put a little plug in for the music industry terms? There's an audio version of that entire site. And I listened to just the start of it. And I think I would recommend it if you like listening to the shipping forecast or maybe like bedtime meditation. Like it's very hypnotic.
Oh, God. Yeah. If you're saying like me talking is like a sleep podcast, then that's fine. It's okay. The people can just go back and listen to this talk, which will be soporific in itself.
Yeah. Should we wrap it up there?
Yeah, sure.
Can we get a round of applause to thank Adam?